40 years you lived only a few steps away from me. 40 years and I had no idea. You kept your promise from that day, never to step into my life again, yet staying close enough to know I was safe. I only learned this after you were gone, leaving me a house and one final letter. And you know, when I stood at the upstairs window of that house, I realized something. All these years, there had been a gaze watching over me, quiet, steadfast, and unchanged. I am Linda. And this is the story I have never dared to tell anyone, until today. Autumn in Portland always carries a strange scent. The crisp tang of red maple leaves blanketing the yard and the faint aroma of coffee drifting from the cafe at the corner. I've grown used to it over the past 5 years, ever since Edward, my husband, passed away. Every morning without fail, I brew a pot of black coffee, pour it into a chipped ceramic mug, and sit at the table by the window. From there, I can watch the sparrows chattering along the wooden fence, and the neighbors I recognize but rarely exchange more than a polite good morning with. I live alone now. My only daughter, Megan, moved to California after she got married. She calls occasionally, asking about my health and reminding me not to overdo the house chores. Still, our conversations always end quickly. She's busy with her job and 2 children. My days repeat like a slow turning wheel. Coffee in the morning, reading at noon, a walk around the neighborhood in the afternoon. I don't complain, but I can't call it happiness either. It's like a song without lyrics, playing endlessly, no crescendo, no ending. Sometimes, looking out the window, I think of my 20s when I believed love could change the world. But those memories feel like an old photograph left forgotten in a drawer. Until one October morning, when a knock at the door shattered the stillness. It came again, louder this time. I set my coffee down and went to answer it. The mailman stood there, cap pulled low over his eyes. He handed me a yellow envelope bearing the logo of a law office in Eugene. Carter and Lane law offices meant nothing to me. I signed for it, closed the door, and returned to the table. Strange, I didn't know anyone in Eugene or have been there in years. I slid the letter opener along the edge of the envelope, my hand trembling slightly. Inside was a typed letter and an old heavy metal key resting cold in my palm. Dear Mrs. Linda Morgan, we represent the late Mr. Daniel Hayes. According to his duly executed and notarized will, Mr. Hayes has left you full ownership of a historic home on Maple Hollow Lane, in the Southern District of Eugene, along with all possessions within. Please contact our office to arrange the completion of inheritance procedures. I reread the name. Daniel Hayes. For a moment I thought my heart had stopped. Daniel, my first love. The man I once loved so deeply, I believed nothing could ever tear us apart. The man who vanished from my life one summer morning in 1981 without a word. 43 years with no contact. No letters. No news. I had long believed he had forgotten me, or worse, deliberately erased me from his life. And now he was gone and had left me a house? I held the key tighter, its chill seeping into my fingers. A flood of questions swirled in my mind. Why? Why now? And where had he been all those years? I walked to the window and stared out at the golden maple leaves. Part of me wanted to put the letter away in a drawer and forget it. But another part, the one I thought had been silent for decades, urged me to seek the answers. I didn't know then that this choice would take me back to a chapter of my life I had thought was closed forever. I sat silently for a long while, the key still resting in my palm. The cold weight of the metal pulled me back to a summer long gone. The summer of 1981. I was 20 then and had newly arrived in Eugene to take a short-term accounting course after leaving Portland. I rented a small room above a cafe called Willow's Corner in the downtown district. That cafe became my morning stop, not just for the good coffee but because of him. Daniel Hayes worked there part-time. He wasn't the kind of man who caught your eye instantly, but his slow, sincere smile made me feel an odd sense of safety. He was tall, with hazel eyes and slightly tousled hair, as though a soft breeze always followed him. We began talking more, moving from polite greetings to long conversations that stretched into the hours after the cafe had closed. Daniel loved reading Steinbeck, while I was fond of Jane Austen. He teased me for being a classic romantic, and I called him a modern dreamer. That summer was a string of beautiful days, riding our bikes to the banks of the Willamette, eating ice cream under the maple trees, and spending evenings on the rooftop watching the city lights. Daniel told me he wanted to open a design studio. I dreamed of a small family and a house with a white picket fence. Then came August, when he said he had to go to Seattle to meet a potential business partner. Just a few days, he promised. But a few days became weeks. I received some postcards, then a handful of letters. By the end of September, all contact had stopped. I waited another month. I called the number he'd given me, only to be told, "There's no one here by the name Daniel Hayes." No explanation. No goodbye. The pain was sharp, but eventually I buried that chapter deep, telling myself he had chosen a road that didn't include me. And now, more than 40 years later, that name had returned, along with a house in the southern part of Eugene on Maple Hollow Lane, a place I had once lived across from for several years after I was married, never knowing it belonged to Daniel. That night I couldn't sleep. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel's name, alongside the image of that house in southern Eugene. Around midnight I got up, opened the closet, and pulled out the small suitcase I hadn't used in years. Packing a few changes of clothes, my walking shoes, and an old notebook took so little time it startled me. Something was stirring inside me, something I thought I had lost long ago. The pull to find answers. When the zipper clicked shut, I reached for my phone and dialed Megan's number. My daughter answered after a few rings, her voice familiar yet somehow distant. "Mom? It's late, is everything all right?" I took a deep breath and briefly told her about the letter from the lawyer in Eugene, and about Daniel leaving me a house. There was a pause, then she asked, her voice edged with tension. "Daniel Hayes, is he the man you loved when you were young?" I said yes, and that I wanted to see the place. "Mom, I don't know what he left you, but this is strange. A man disappears for over 40 years and suddenly leaves you property. You have to be careful." I tried to keep my tone light. "I'm only going to look, don't worry." Megan sighed and told me to send her the address and keep in touch if I went. Promised. The next morning, Portland was clear and cold. I locked my front door, set my suitcase in the trunk, and hit the road. The drive along the Willamette was carpeted in golden leaves, the early sunlight filtering through the trees like shards of broken memories. Each mile brought me closer to the answers, and to a chapter of my life I had thought was closed forever. The road into southern Eugene hadn't changed much from how I remembered it. Still, it felt entirely different driving through alone. On either side, rows of old maple trees had turned a deep crimson, their leaves rustling down to the pavement whenever a gust of wind passed. I slowed the car, scanning for the street sign that read Maple Hollow Lane, just as it had been written in the letter. The house appeared suddenly at a bend. A two-story craftsman painted a soft gray-blue, with a sloped roof and a wide front porch. At first glance I could tell it had been well cared for. The porch swept clean, the steps free of a single stain, pots of golden chrysanthemums still blooming despite the late season. I pulled over to the curb, turned off the engine and sat briefly. Something about it felt familiar. Stepping out, the morning chill brushed against my face, sharpening my senses. I looked up and my gaze drifted past Daniel's house to the other side of the street, and my heart clenched. Directly opposite stood a white house with a matching white picket fence, the place I had lived in with Edward during the first 7 years of our marriage. I could still remember each brick in the walkway leading up to the porch, where we planted rows of tulips every spring. Since we moved to Portland, I hadn't set foot here in over 30 years. And yet, I was standing in front of the house across from it, a house that had belonged to Daniel. Shock and confusion swelled inside me. How long had he owned it? Had he known I was living right across the street? And all that time, what had he been doing? I tightened my grip on the key and climbed the steps. The wooden door had a polished grain, and the lock looked new. When I slid the key in, it turned smoothly, as if the door had been opened often. As I pushed it open, the hinges gave a soft creak, and a wave of old wood and faint lavender drifted out to greet me. The living room was spacious, with low ceilings crossed by dark wooden beams. Light filtered through the curtains, pooling over a leather armchair beside the fireplace. Everything was tidy, free of dust, as though someone had cleaned it not long ago. Room by room I found the same neat, orderly, and empty. There was no sign of a family living here, no photographs, no personal belongings, only a few essential pieces of furniture. It felt less like a home and more like a place meant for brief shelter. I stopped at the living room window, instinctively pulling the curtain aside. From here, the view of the White House across the street was unobstructed. Anyone here could have seen me leaving for work in the morning, watering flowers in the yard, or reading on the porch. A shiver ran down my spine. I turned away, trying to shake the feeling, but my heart beat faster than usual. I knew I needed to dig deeper, to find out who had been caring for this place all these years. And above all, I needed to understand why Daniel had left it to me. I had just put my suitcase down in the living room when there was a knock on the door. For a moment my heart jumped. I half wondered if I had unknowingly walked into someone else's home. But when I opened it, a man in his 60s stood wearing a thick fabric coat and holding a jangling ring of keys. His neatly cropped hair was silver, his skin tanned like someone accustomed to working outdoors. "You're Linda Morgan?" he asked, his voice deep but friendly. I nodded. "I'm Walter. I've been looking after this house for Mr. Hayes, Daniel Hayes. The lawyer told me you'd be coming." Hearing Daniel's name spoken aloud by someone else made my chest tighten. I invited him in, and Walter stepped inside with a slow, deliberate gait, as though he didn't want to disturb the quiet in the house. He set the ring of keys on the table, and explained that Daniel had hired him to care for the property since 1992. Mostly mowing the lawn, sweeping leaves, checking the heating system, and sometimes opening the windows to let the air in, he said. I asked if Daniel had lived here full-time. Walter shook his head. Not in the early years. He'd only come a few times a year, stay for a few days, then leave again. About 10 years ago, he moved in for good but still rarely went out. He liked the quiet. Walter paused, his eyes drifting toward the window that faced the White House across the street. He used to stand here a lot. Just stand and look across the road, silent. I never asked why. A chill crept up my spine, though the sun still shone on the porch outside. Trying to keep my voice steady, I asked about the years I had lived across the street. Walter nodded slowly. I remember he wasn't here then. The house stayed empty, but he told me to keep it as it was. No renting, no selling. He said, I need it that way. He didn't elaborate or need to. That single sentence was enough to set off 100 possibilities in my mind. When I asked if Daniel had left any belongings or papers behind, Walter gestured for me to follow him upstairs. The staircase gave a soft creak under each step. The hallway above was narrow but bright, lit by a window at the far end. Walter opened a door halfway down the hall to reveal a small, tidy room, almost to the point of feeling cold. Inside was a wooden desk, a chair, and a single bookshelf. On the desk, beneath a thin layer of dust, sat a dark wooden box. Walter said he had never touched it because Daniel had told him, only the person I leave the house to can open it. I sat down in the chair and placed my hands on the box. The smooth, cool surface made me hesitate, unsure if I should open it now or later. Without another word, Walter quietly left the room, leaving me alone. Sunlight streamed through the window, falling across the desk, and I noticed a small lock on the front of the box. In my coat pocket was still the brass key the lawyer had sent me. I held it momentarily, studying its worn edges, then slid it into the lock. Fit perfectly. A soft click broke the silence, opening the door to whatever Daniel had wanted me to find. I took a deep breath before lifting the lid. The box gave a soft creak, releasing the scent of old wood mingled with the faint mustiness of yellowed paper, as though it held an entire fragment of the past inside. Lying on top was a bundle of letters tied with a dark blue ribbon, its color faded with age. I recognized the slanted handwriting instantly, my own, the letters I had written to Daniel in the summer of 1981. I had thought they were lost to time, yet here they were, kept neatly as if they were treasures. Beneath the letters were several postcards from Eugene, Seattle, and even Portland, most of them never sent. Each carried the same voice. Short, almost hesitant, sometimes no more than a single line like, "It rained today. I remembered you laughing under the cafe awning," or "The house across the street has tulips blooming again." And then I realized these were Daniel's private notes to himself, words he had written but never mailed to me. The deeper I went, the faster my heart beat. There was a thin leather-bound journal with no title on the cover. I opened it, and on the first page was a trembling line. Maple Hollow Lane, 1985-1992. The years I only dared to watch from afar. I skimmed a few pages. Daniel had recorded in painstaking detail the small moments he saw me through the window. This morning she wore a green dress, hair pulled back, coffee cup in hand, standing on the porch. This afternoon she planted tulips, perhaps for the coming spring. Heavy rain today. She ran into the house quickly, but still turned back to glance at the sky. There was no intrusion, nothing crossing a line. Yet each sentence was a quiet shard of a love held tightly, never spoken aloud. I had to pause, my throat tightening. Memories I thought had cooled long ago flared back to life, vivid enough that I could almost feel the warmth of those mornings again. A sealed cream envelope at the bottom of the box, marked in firm but slightly wavering handwriting. For Linda, open only when I am no longer here. I sat still for a long time, staring at it. Outside, the wind had picked up, setting the maples across the street whispering. I wondered, had Daniel always stood at this very window, watching me water the flowers, watching me carry Megan when she was learning to walk, watching me hang Christmas wreaths on the door? And if he had, what had he thought all those years, seeing me live a life with someone else? When I finally slid my finger beneath the flap, a folded sheet of paper slipped out. The faint scent of old paper rose, and I began to read. The words before me were not just a message, they were a fragment of that man's soul. Linda, if you are reading this, it means I have gone before you. I've thought long and hard about how to begin, but every word feels clumsy when speaking of the 40 years that have passed. I know that the day you returned to Portland, you believed I had abandoned you, that what we had was nothing more than a fleeting summer. The truth is, I never wanted to leave. When I went to Seattle in 1981, I meant to be gone only a few weeks. But then came an opportunity to grow my work and I got swept into it. I kept writing to you so many letters, but someone I once trusted never sent them. I didn't discover this until I returned to Eugene at the end of 1983, and by then you were preparing to marry. I didn't come to find you that day. I stood across the street and saw you leaving a diner with your fiancé, and I knew that if I stepped in, I would only make things harder for you. Perhaps the best thing I could do was let you be happy with the life you had chosen. In 1985, when I heard you had moved to Maple Hollow Lane, I did the most foolish thing I've ever done. I bought the house across from yours. Not to disrupt your family, but because I couldn't stay away entirely. I had Walter hold the title and look after it, keeping it empty. Now and then I would return, stand at the window, and see you smile on the porch, planting tulips, and carrying Megan to the yard. Those moments were all I dared keep for myself. When you moved to Portland in 1992, I came to live here. There was no one across the street to watch anymore. But this house had already become filled with memories, of you, of the years that could never be reclaimed. I lived alone, never married, not because I was against marriage, but because I could never love anyone enough to forget you. Hearing this might trouble you, perhaps even anger you. But I have no regrets. Every spring I planted tulips on the porch, even when no one was there to see them. Every Christmas I hung a wreath like the one you used to hang. And each time I did, I felt you were still somewhere close. This house is yours now if you wish to keep it. Not to remind you of what's been lost, but so you will know that, for all my life, you have been loved in the most accurate way I knew how. I don't ask you to return that love. I only want you to know the truth so you will never again think I abandoned you. If I have one regret, it is that I never found the courage to knock on your door, just once, to tell you I was still here. Goodbye, Linda. Thank you for that summer. For giving my life a place to belong. Daniel. I set the letter down on the table, my hand still trembling. The room was steeped in silence, broken only by the sound of wind slipping through the cracks. Every line I read pulled me back into a time I had worked hard to lock away. Fragments of memory stitched themselves together. Daniel's smile in the late afternoon at the cafe, the light in his eyes when he spoke of his plans, the warmth of his hand holding mine. I didn't know how long I sat there, but when I finally stood, I felt as if I was carrying part of our story on my shoulders, heavy, yet in a strange way lighter than before. Outside, the White House across the street stood exactly as it had, silent and familiar. I walked to the window and looked over. For the first time in years, I didn't see the distance of a road between us. Still, a thread binding two houses, two lives, and a love that had endured nearly half a century just to be spoken through one final letter. I was still in a daze when I heard slow, measured footsteps in the hall. Walter stood at the door, holding a steaming cup of tea. "I thought you might need something warm," he said, setting it on the table. I nodded in thanks, my voice still caught in my throat. "Mr. Walter, how long had you known Daniel?" He sat beside me, his hands clasped together since the early 80s. "I worked for a construction company, and we repaired this roof before Daniel bought the place. But it wasn't until 1992, when he moved in full-time, that we became friends. He was a man of few words but polite and dependable. Always paid on time, sometimes a little extra." I hesitated before asking the question I truly wanted to. "Did he ever mention me?" Walter took a sip of tea, his eyes narrowing slightly as if searching through his memory. "Not by name. But I noticed something. Every year, he'd ask me to get tulips for the porch at the start of spring. Always the same kind, yellow with a touch of red. I once asked why not try another color, and he just smiled and said, 'This color is the most familiar.'" A sharp ache went through me. "Anything else?" Walter nodded slowly. "Every Christmas he'd hang a simple wreath, just pine branches and a few cones. No lights, no ribbons. I thought it strange for such a beautiful house to have such a plain decoration. Now I suppose it meant something to him." I turned back toward the White House across the street. I remember hanging a wreath like that during our first Christmas on Maple Hollow Lane. Edward had said it looked too plain. But I loved its simplicity. I hadn't known someone else had noticed, and kept that tradition alive for decades. Walter gave a small chuckle, as if recalling something. "Oh, once, maybe 15 years ago, I was here fixing the chimney. I climbed up to the roof and saw Daniel at the upstairs window, looking out at the street. It was snowing that day, and I asked him what he looked at. He said, 'It looks exactly like it did in 1986. I didn't understand then, but I suppose you do now." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Mr. Walter, do you know why Daniel left this house to me?" Walter shook his head. "I don't. But I imagine it's because he had no close family, and wanted you to have it. From how he cared for every detail, I don't think this house was ever just a house to him." We sat in silence for a while. Steam curled gently from the cup on the table, the soft scent of mint filling the air. Outside, the sunlight angled through the trees, casting golden streaks across the pavement. Walter rose, slowly slipping back into his coat. "If you need anything, I live just a few blocks away. Just knock and I'll come. One last thing." He paused, then smiled faintly. "I don't think Daniel ever really left you. Not just because the houses were close, but because the distance in his heart never changed." The door closed softly behind Walter, leaving me alone in the quiet. I turned back to the wooden box on the table, the open letter, and the neat stack of postcards beside it. Some pieces had begun to fall into place. Yet there was still an empty space, the missing years from the beginning, when Daniel first vanished from my life. The house seemed even more silent after Walter left. I sat longer, staring at Daniel's letter, feeling as though the words I'd read had only skimmed the surface of something more profound. As I gathered the papers, I noticed another envelope wedged against the bottom of the box. The paper was yellowed, but the handwriting was unmistakable. "For Linda, if you are ready to know everything." My heartbeat quickened. I broke the seal. Inside was a minor brass key and a slip of paper with just 4 words. "Second floor, east corner." I climbed the stairs, the old wood groaning beneath my steps. The east corner was the room I hadn't opened during my walk through the house that morning. The lock was snug, but the brass key turned smoothly, releasing the latch. The room was small, with dim light filtering through a dust-coated window. In the center stood a tall wooden cabinet draped with a faded cloth. The top shelf was empty. The second held a few cardboard boxes tied with twine. The third was heavier. Inside lay a dark leather-bound journal and a large bundle of letters tied with ribbon. I sat down and opened the journal. The first page was dated in the summer of 1981, when we met. Daniel's handwriting was steady. "Each time I came back, I found a way to stand at the window and watch you water the flowers across the street. Just a few days and then I had to leave again. I knew I should forget, but my heart wanted to keep that image one more time. Then one more until 40 years had passed." I untied the bundle of letters. Every envelope bore my name, my old address on Maple Hollow Lane, and none had ever been mailed. The first was written after my wedding. I hope you are happy, though it feels like my heart has been torn. If someday you need a friend, I will still be here. The last written less than a year ago. If you are reading this, it means I am gone. But I am at peace, because not a single day of my life passed without you in my sight. I set the letters down, my hands trembling. Part of me wanted to weep for all the years lost, for the moments he could have stepped closer but chose instead to stand still, in silence. Another part felt a quiet warmth, the knowledge that I had never truly been as alone as I had believed. I pressed the journal to my chest and closed my eyes. The feeling was comfort and a sharp twist of time's knife. Now the pieces fit together. He had never really disappeared. He had been there all along, watching, preserving every small detail, to keep alive an invisible thread between us. Outside the window, the late afternoon sunlight spilled gold across the porch. I understood then that the decision ahead was no longer simply about keeping or leaving a house. It was about whether I was willing to let a love that had waited in silence for 40 years step into the present. I sat alone in the living room, the last light of day stretching across the wooden floor. Beside me lay the leather-bound journal and the ribbon-tied bundle of letters. The things that had just pulled me back into a part of my life, I thought had long since gone still. My fingers brushed over each envelope, and it felt like I was touching a parallel timeline where Daniel and I had never parted. But then Edward's face came to mind, my husband. The mornings he made coffee, the familiar grimace when I hung that plain pine wreath for our first Christmas on Maple Hollow Lane. I had never gone a day without remembering him, and the warmth he brought had carried me through 40 years. I spoke aloud, as if to both men who had passed through my life. I'm not choosing one over the other. You're both part of me. Looking around the house, I realized it wasn't just the place where Daniel had quietly watched over me. It was also a piece of ground that had held my youth, my early years as a wife, the days I carried my daughter to the porch when the rain fell. To sell it would be to lose a part of myself. My hand rested on the journal as I slowly turned back through Daniel's pages. Somewhere in that silence, I could almost hear him chuckle softly, no urging or demand, simply there. Perhaps that was why he left the house to me. Not so I would live with his shadow, but so I would remember that I had been loved in more than one way. I stepped onto the porch, breathing in the late afternoon air. The white house across the street now stood empty. However, in my memory, I still saw myself watering flowers in the morning, with someone standing far away watching. Not to cling to the past, but to know I had once mattered to someone that much. That night I took a blank sheet of paper and wrote a single line. I will stay. I placed it inside the journal. It was my answer to Daniel, Edward, and me. 3 days later, I returned to the office of Mr. Harris, the lawyer who had sent Daniel's first letter. The small room, smelling faintly of oak and old paper, felt like a vault of time. Mr. Harris rose to shake my hand, his manner professional but tinged with curiosity. Mrs. Thompson, all the transfer documents are ready. Once you sign, the house will be officially yours. He slid a thick stack of papers toward me. I sat down, pen in hand, but didn't sign immediately. If I choose not to sell this house and keep it, will there be any legal complications? Mr. Harris shook his head. No, ma'am. It's yours outright. You have full authority over it. In most cases, when people inherit property from someone outside the family, they sell it to avoid difficulties. He left the sentence hanging, but I understood. I gave a faint smile. I'll keep it. This place means more to me than any amount of money. He nodded, setting aside whatever unspoken questions lingered in his eyes. When I signed the last page, he opened a desk drawer and took out a thin cream-colored envelope. One more thing. Mr. Daniel left this, instructing me to give it to you only once everything was finalized. He called it the last word. I took the envelope. It was heavier than expected and didn't feel like it contained only paper. My heart thudded as it had when I first found the journal upstairs. Thank you, I said, rising to my feet. Mr. Harris shook my hand again. Mr. Daniel, he wasn't a man of many words, but he saw it through when he did something for someone. You're among the few who ever received that from him. I stepped outside, pressing the envelope to my chest. The April sky in Portland hung gray with damp clouds. Still, inside me there was a different kind of sunlight, warm and bittersweet, like the last rays slipping through Daniel's window at the end of the day. I didn't go inside right away when I reached Maple Hollow Lane. I stood beneath the porch roof, the envelope still tight in my hand. I knew whatever lay inside would be the final piece of this story, and I was ready to open it. I sat at the wooden table in the living room, the cream envelope lying before me. After a long pause, I drew a deep breath and broke the dark red wax seal. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, and something small that slipped out into my hand. A thin, simple silver ring with 3 letters engraved on the inside, LMB. My maiden initials. My heart tightened. How many years had Daniel kept this ring? I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was familiar, though no longer as steady as in his earlier letters, a slight tremor in some strokes, as if written when his strength was already fading. Linda, by the time you read this, I will likely be gone. I have thought about whether I should leave you this letter, because I don't want to pull you back into a chapter that has already closed. But I realize that you would only ever know part of the story if I didn't tell you everything. I never wished for you to choose me over Edward. Knowing you were happy was enough for me. I lived all those years sustained by the image of you smiling in your home, even if I was only standing at the edge. This house is not a gift for you to remember me by. It is for you to place yourself. The young woman who once loved without holding back, who once dared to dream. I hope it will remind you that you can still love and dream, no matter your age. If I have one regret, it is that I let fear and pride keep me from crossing that narrow street between our 2 houses. We both missed more than we needed to. Don't miss anything more, Linda. Whether it's a new tulip season, a journey far from home, or a morning spent listening to the rain. Thank you for existing in my life in a way no one else ever could. Always, Daniel. I set the letter down, my fingers unconsciously tracing the silver ring. A tide of emotion welled up, not only sorrow for losing Daniel, but gratitude for how he had chosen to love me. Without possession, demand, simply holding and cherishing. I thought of Edward. If he were still here, would he understand? Perhaps he would frown, sigh, and say that familiar line. Linda, you've always had a way of being remembered. I smiled through quiet tears. Now I knew that keeping this house was not about holding on to Daniel, nor was it a betrayal of Edward. It was about keeping a part of my history, a part that reminded me I had once been deeply loved, and had once loved with all my heart. I closed the letter and placed it with the ring inside the wooden box. Outside the window, the sky began to clear after the rain. Light poured into the room, as though Daniel had quietly opened a door somewhere inside me, a door through which I could walk into the rest of my life, lighter and more whole than before. A month later, the garden by the porch had changed colors. I knelt over the freshly turned soil, carefully setting each yellow and red tulip bulb into a neat row. The same flowers bloomed brightly every spring outside Daniel's porch. Now they would bloom in my yard, not to hold on to his shadow, but to remind myself that some things are beautiful enough to endure through many seasons, through entire lifetimes. In one corner I placed a pot of white roses, the kind Edward had loved. Their pure fragrance mingled with the scent of damp earth, like a bridge between 2 memories I once feared would clash. But there was no clash anymore, only the peace of knowing I could keep them both. When Christmas came, I hung a plain pine wreath on the door. No lights, ribbons, just a few dried cones. A young neighbor stopped by, asking why I didn't add more color. I smiled. Because this is enough. That night, I stood at the upstairs window, looking out at the street bathed in the soft glow of lamplight. No one stood in the opposite window anymore. Yet I still felt watched over, not by a single person but by memories, by the words left to me, and by a love that had passed but left a trace too deep to fade. I wasn't looking for anything for the first time in years. I stood still, knowing this is my home. Some loves don't need to begin again, nor do they need to end. They remain quiet as the groundwater beneath the earth, nourishing seasons of flowers yet to bloom. Daniel and Linda did not spend a lifetime together. Still, they lived in each other's hearts for a lifetime. Perhaps that is the truest kind of lasting happiness. I believe each of us has someone like that. Someone whose name alone can summon years and moments as if they'd never left. Not to make us regret, but to remind us that we have lived, have loved, and have been loved. Keeping a beautiful memory is not holding on to the past. It is a way of telling ourselves, I was once important to someone. For that, I deserve to be happy now. If while hearing this story a name, a face, or a faraway afternoon has come to mind, let that feeling stay a little longer. And if you wish, write it down in the comments, the person's name, or simply, I once did. I will read them all, because each of your stories is a piece of the quiet miracle we call love. And if you want to join me on more journeys like this, stories that don't shout yet reach the deepest part of the heart, subscribe and turn on the bell. We will meet again in the following story.